So hi, my name is Ramatoulies Muhammad. People call me Rama. I attended Hampton University, graduated in 2015, and have worked in Africa and recently moved back to the States, working in infrastructure transportation projects. And back when I was working in Africa, I was working on a lot of institutional projects, hospitals, education, that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
What about your experience do you want to share with us tonight?
Well, a lot of my experiences are kind of similar to what Jessica went through, but what I would really like to focus on in terms of my experience is my experience attending an HBCU
For sure.
and HBCUs in general, as well as my general professional experience. So as I mentioned, I went to Hampton University. Very fortunate to live on the East Coast where there are so many great historically Black programs, because you kind of don't realize that so many of them are fixated here on the East Coast. Maybe everybody else doesn't get an opportunity to attend because of that distance. But one thing about HBCUs is I feel like people don't really understand how little others know about HBCUs. Like, we had a conversation within my architecture department here in Virginia, and one of the questions was, why do people attend HBCUs? Why are they intentionally separating themselves? Doesn't that go against sort of what we're trying to do in terms of inclusion and diversity? And you're like, you don't know. You don't know why they're there in the first place. So I feel like, but that's from somebody who's been in the industry for a very long time, and I feel like people just don't know what they don't know when it comes to Black people and race and HBCUs in general. And there are a lot of architecture programs all over the country, but people, Black people attend, 30% of Black architects attend an HBCU, and HBCUs award 52% of pre-professional degrees in architecture. Wow. And that's astounding, out of only 7 programs in the entire United States. That's just a really crazy number to think about. So as Jessica was mentioning, in terms of her minority focused program, being able to have that community around you supporting you and sort of being seen as more than just your race. You're seen as sort of what you're bringing to the table, what your actual skills are, what your ideas are, and your race not necessarily being the deciding factor, because it's mostly Black people, maybe about 80% Black people. And I think that's another sort of misconception people have about HBCUs. They think, it's all Black, complete separation and exclusion, but it's actually a very large ethnic mix. A lot of people don't know, actually, in terms of Hampton University, it was very famous for its program with Native American students, and has a lot of variety with international students even today. So there's a lot of diversity that people don't know about and don't see in terms of HBCU programs. And another thing I want to bring up in terms of HBCUs is that because a lot of people don't see how important they are, they don't receive as much support, since people are assuming, the majority are coming from PWIs, primarily white institutions. They don't think that they need as much help, but it's very critical. That's where so many of our architectural talent are coming from. So one thing I wanted to give on this call is just a couple of pointers for people in terms of how they can support HBCU architecture students. Number one, you can donate to their architecture programs directly. Most schools have ways you can directly donate to that specific program. You can donate supplies. I don't know if anybody else had those same issues where you're trying to find a piece of cardboard that's not busted out. I got into a couple of issues with footprints on my projects. So yes, that was a problem for me, and very problematic in its consistency. Donating study materials. A lot of people don't realize how much work goes into studying for these architecture registration exams. And being able to start that process in school can be a huge benefit to people, because passing these exams takes such a long time, years and years for some. And I feel like that's kind of glossed over. And, attending crits and volunteering to visit the students while they're there, is very critical. And, you know, just being able to pop in, just contacting the studio leads and finding out, hey, can I come in and talk and find out what your students are working on? And you might even find some amazing talent that you want to bring back to your company and just get those ideas for yourself, you know. And last but not least is supporting the AIAS and NOMAS chapters. Like maybe you want to donate to those chapters specifically, or maybe sponsor a trip to conferences and stuff like that. That'd be a huge boon, being able to get, you know, more visibility, more networking with other architects and people within the industry. So those are just some things I wanted to leave everybody with, just some things you can do to sort of help students at HBCUs. One of the things that I feel like they need to touch on more in architecture school in general is the registration experience overall and how that, you know, affects Black students. Most Black students don't have a lot of exposure in terms of architects and the architecture industry, construction industry. But one thing I didn't know when I was starting my process, my formal process after I graduated, is in the state of Virginia, you actually have to have 3 separate people championing you in terms of your ethics and morals, and they become sort of like your sponsors in a way. And they have to be registered architects that you've known for over a year. And imagine you don't know any architects that can speak up for you, vouch for you. And if your school doesn't have a mentoring program, a networking program in place, that can be a huge obstacle for someone. And that's just to get your foot in the door of the registration process. And yeah, that's something I wish was highlighted more. And the ARE process, I feel like, was not touched on as much as it should have been. And the financial burden of these exams, I feel like, wasn't stressed enough. Like 230 plus per exam for each retake, nobody gives you that information. And Black architecture students have some of the highest rates of debt compared to all other architecture students. I know right now in the United States, we have a huge problem in terms of college education and financing, and everybody's like, oh, we're all suffering. But for Black male and female architecture students, that number is upward in the hundreds of thousands. And a lot of people don't realize that huge burden is there. So compounding that on top of the cost of the AREs, that can be a huge challenge, especially not knowing about it. And the last, I want to talk about the AXP process, the experience program. Again, with that whole mentorship, sponsorship aspect, if you don't have someone who's in your corner, willing to even sign your experience packages, that can be a huge problem, getting someone to sort of actively mentor you. And make sure you go through each of the points. Like, I know I've struggled a lot in terms of getting my supervisors to be on board and really taking this process seriously if I'm not like dogging them and sending them emails all the time to remind them. And the thing is that the profession does have a responsibility to help. I know it's not their job, but it's their responsibility as professionals to help foster those that come after them. And I feel like that's not being pushed as much. And I feel like in terms of that whole diversity aspect in architecture, that's one of the places where people in practice are failing the most. That's where they have the opportunity to make the most difference. And I feel like that's where they're actually failing the most in everyday practice. And in terms of my professional experiences, I've had a lot of similar experiences to Jessica in terms of microaggressions, especially in terms of hair, because I'm pretty freewheeling with my hair. I'm liable to walk in with anything on any day. But that's also prompted a lot of comments from everyone of all races and genders, and it's not a lot of fun. I would say in general that if you're not a Black woman with Black hair, you're probably just on the safer side not mentioning it. If you want to, say it looks nice, say nothing after that, and you'll be good. Because I've gotten some pretty wild comments, even from Black people telling me about, you know, the values they associate with whichever hairstyle I have at that particular time. And it's like, you have no idea what's going on under here. And it would honestly just be better if you just didn't bring it up. because it's very frustrating to me when people start to have opinions on something they don't know about, not even just like commenting on what it looks like, but having an actual opinion on something they know nothing about. That's very, very frustrating to me. And that's can be a whole cultural issue as well, in terms of what going into an office not knowing what they consider professional or not. Like, I have an afro, but I've never worn it out into the office until I was working there for like several months, because I didn't feel comfortable wearing my actual hair out in the office because I was worried it might seem unprofessional. And luckily California has those restrictions on hair discrimination. I don't think Virginia has those. I should check. I don't think they do. But, there can be whole things about cornrows and other different hairstyles. They're pretty open about dreads. But the thing for me with cornrows is that I'm also West African as part of my heritage. And for me, cornrows are a very, very professional, very respectable style. But for someone else, they seem hood or ghetto or unprofessional. And that can be a very frustrating balance to strike. So that's been something that I've kind of wrestled with. At my company, we have a Black employee network. I work at Jacobs, we're a fairly large organization, and we have a Black employee network to sort of, create a community and help each other, mentor each other. They host lots of organizational events. They hosted a leadership summit last year. And the CEO of the company is the executive sponsor for the organization, which is pretty huge. And I would love for more people, not just at the executive level, but also at the sort of managerial level, the people leader level, to be that sort of invested in the employee networks or Black employee groups, because I feel like that's also where we can get a lot of change made. The people who have to deal with Black employees on an everyday basis, I feel like that would make a really huge change. And that relationship that you have with your manager can really make or break you as an architect. Like, I've had a lot of different types of managers, and some managers will make you throw up your hands and be like, I need to be out of this firm like tomorrow. And I feel like dealing with those difficult relationships, not just as a Black person, but also as a woman in architecture, can be very frustrating, because you sort of have to constantly be walking a fine line between, standing up for yourself and being seen as aggressive or combative. And I've actually had situations where, people say that I'm coming across as aggressive, but I'm not really. In my mind, I'm actually babying people. Like, it's a very interesting dynamic. And I've had situations where people have complained to my manager about me being aggressive. And then when it all shakes out, it turns out that, I was sending multiple emails politely asking people for stuff that they didn't give me. And all of it led up to this point. So it's just sort of dealing with those stereotypes and those perceptions of you, even if you think you're doing everything right to be seen as non-combative as possible, that can be very frustrating. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that sounds very draining to have to watch yourself that way. I had a question about the HBCU. Does it open up more opportunity for mentorship after that? Does it help build your network? Have you found in your experience? Like, were you able to take some of that with you whenever you graduated?
Yeah, actually, all the people that I had as my personal sponsors when I was registering as an architect in Virginia, I met all of them through Hampton. And Hampton University also has a big brother, big sister program where alumni do come through and mentor you. And my big brother was also one of my sponsors for registration. So I would say it has a pretty big effect. Those connections are very important. And another interesting aspect is it introduces you to a lot of Black architects that you might not meet otherwise. Like, if they do come and visit your crits or come to your classroom, or if they're your big brother or sister, they say about 40% of HBCU architecture students know 5 or more Black architects. So I would sort of ask everybody on the call to sort of think, maybe list out all the Black architects you know, see if you can name more than 5. So that's a really interesting situation that happens because of HBCUs.
Yeah, it sounds like a very different experience, but it sounds like it's a really incredible one. I learned a lot about that just
Yeah,
now.
it is. I just wanted to add, Rama, thank you so much for that. One person did come up, Isabel asked, where in Africa did you work? And she wanted to know, how did your experience in Africa compare to your experience here in the US? Which that was a question I had from myself. So inquiring minds want to know.
Mhm. So I worked in Gambia for a short bit before I graduated. After graduation, I worked in Namibia, which is in Southern Africa, right above South Africa. Um, and the experience there was very interesting because in some aspects, they're less formal than the States. So I was working in what would be considered over here like a project architect position. But because, there's less sort of rules around that kind of thing, I could sort of just jump in, be managing projects and stuff like that. But one of the hangups is that when you're in a different country, you're also dealing with different cultures. And so I would say that there are probably more restrictions on me because I was a woman working over there than I might have experienced over here. Like, for example, I was working on a project, again, sort of like in that project architect, project manager position. And I had a site visit that I needed to go to or attend on a project that I'd been working on for months. And the principal's like, no, you can't go. We have to send a guy instead because, if you go up there, nobody's going to respect you. And that's just like, I was mad, but I got it. And that's the kind of thing that you also have to deal with up there. To a certain extent, you might also have to deal with it in the States. People do still not take you seriously as a Black woman in general. Like if you're not like sitting there literally giving people directions, they're just going to assume you're kind of the secretary or something like that. So, I mean, you experience those kinds of things everywhere. One thing I did find frustrating was the registration process over there, because when I was there, up until recently, they didn't have a master's program for architecture in the country, but they did require a master's in order to become a registered architect. So that was a huge obstacle for, the people living there, and that I can't even become an architect in my own country with a degree I can get in my own country. Like that was really wild to me. They recently got their master's program, but it seemed a bit strange. So it's also resulted in a lot of foreign architects coming to work in the country because they're the only ones with the qualifications.
Interesting.
Wow.
Well, I think you said a lot of things that make perfect sense. And I think one of the things, coming from Howard, the other HU, Howard, this is where I went to school. I think, I can actually name off 10 people that I know that were getting an architectural degree. I could probably name off 10 or 15 civil engineers that were amazing in terms of what they did. And I think HBCUs have historically been overlooked when it comes to mining talent for the design industry. I've told every firm leader that would listen that you need to start visiting these schools. You need to start getting with these students early and often. And I think, again, now that more dialogue is happening, it could probably convince more people to do some things that they wouldn't necessarily spend money on previously. Now is the time to start opening up and asking those questions. The other thing that I'm definitely going to bring up with some firm leaders that I know that are leaders of firms of upwards of over 1,000 plus people is, and I didn't realize this, and I should have, but you bring up a good point about just sometimes the lack of having the supplies and things that you need in school itself, and how sometimes that can also help the process. The cost of taking exams. I mean, those are all things that we tend to overlook. We just look at somebody that's a newly minted architect and say, okay, it's all great, but there's so much that requires that has to be done to get you to that point. And I think we forget about that part of it. And I think it's important. And honestly, I think it's a great recruitment tool for firms to try to support that part of the process, because if I was an architect coming out of Scott, if I was studying architecture coming out of school, I'd be more inclined to look at a firm that was trying to support my program, that was trying to potentially support me and other architects that are trying to do the same thing. So I think it's a really great idea to try to promote more of that. Not to look at it as a handout, but it's like, listen, this is a perfect pool of people that can come in and be a part of what your organization is doing. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I appreciate that, and thank you for sharing those stories.
Mm-hmm. Talking about mining talent, like I remember during the career fairs, when I was in school, it's changed a bit now, but when I was in school, like you'd go to the career fairs, but it was kind of a waste of time because there were no architecture firms there. You could maybe go to the Army desk for the Army Corps of Engineers, but there were no architecture firms there for you.
Yeah,
So
that's been a problem though. I mean, historically, architectural firms outside of maybe a few, they did not spend the time going back even to their alma maters to develop the talent that was there. And that's a shame, because it's like it's kind of like built in. If I was an architect, I would have been going back to Howard every year to I would have just had a pipeline, and you almost have to create that and encourage firm leaders to look at that as a simple way to develop new talent, especially diverse talent, like yourself and everybody else that's on this call.